Hi, and welcome to TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers, a program of educators worldwide. I'm your host today, Melanie Gobert.
Hello, everyone. This is Melanie Gobert, your host for today's episode of TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers. Joining us today is Naghmeh Babaee. She is on the Liberal Studies faculty at LaSalle College, Vancouver, Canada. She teaches liberal studies courses, mainly academic writing and humanities. Today, she's going to be talking to us about teaching in a second language using multilingual students' first language. Welcome, Naghmeh.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I'm very happy to be here and with your guests.
Okay. So first of all, how can a teacher's professional identity, language policy, and language ideology impact their teaching and assessment methods in multilingual classes?
This is a very good question, and research shows that the way teachers define themselves as a teacher can definitely impact the way they teach and the way they respond to a student's potential challenges, especially language and academic challenges. So if we think about a math teacher, for example, if this math teacher assumes that she or he is just a math teacher and the responsibility is just to teach math, when this person teaches a student with English language needs, they might unintentionally, not out of bad intentions, but just unintentionally ignore the student's language needs because they assume that language needs are not the responsibility of a math teacher to resolve. On the other hand, if the same teacher assumes that my responsibility is to teach math, but at the same time, it's very important for me to make sure that my students understand the lessons that I teach them and are able to understand the assignment instructions, then that will definitely make an impact on the way they design assignments and lectures and reading materials. And they try to make these materials linguistically accessible to all the students, particularly students with language needs. So that's the part about teacher identity. So how they see themselves and their role in the teaching and learning context. Regarding language policy and language ideology, this is a bigger discussion because sometimes teachers assume that they should teach in just in English only or whatever language is the language of instruction at that institution. And if they have this English only policy or this, second language only policy, they might just, go ahead and teach only in English and encourage students to use only English. On the other hand, if they believe that the students can use whatever language they know in order to learn a new lesson in a new language, then they will allow students to use multilingual learning strategies. And this is what I will be talking about in more details in this podcast. And also the language policy, that's very important. Language policy is not just set by the teacher, but also by the institutions where they work. And I know that in some places in Canada and elsewhere, the policy is just, English only or the dominant language only. And I've been to language institutions where the first thing that I noticed when I entered the building was a big sign that read English only, please speak English only. That shows the language policy of the institution. And in such a context, then students and teachers are expected to use only English or only that language, whatever language that has been assigned by the institution.
Okay, well, what would you say about people who argued that the reason it's English only is because we want the students to become more proficient in English, and that's the way you do it?
I understand this concern, and this is a very valid concern, especially in contexts where English is not spoken outside class. Like, to give you an example, in Iran, English is a foreign language, which means that English doesn't have an official status and English is not used in society. So the only context where people use English is within language classes. And so, of course, in this context, the students are encouraged to use only English because teachers want them to be exposed to English as much as possible. But I would argue that even in such context, using English doesn't mean forgetting about other languages that the students know. Like losing one language doesn't mean that other languages should be ignored. All languages that the students know could be used strategically, right? So not just one at the expense of forgetting about others.
Okay, how can teachers encourage bilingual and multilingual students to use their first language to learn in an additional language?
This is what I use in my classes, specifically in my academic writing courses. So to give context, in the courses that I teach are undergraduate courses, and I have students from different linguistic backgrounds. And when they come to my class, they know at least two languages, English plus one, at least one more language. So what I do the first session when I want to teach them formal and informal English communication. Before we talk about English communication, I ask them to think about and give the class examples of formal and informal words, expressions, and sentences in their first language. And this is a very nice ice-breaking activity because the students are usually positively surprised that the instructor is asking them to give examples of their first language. And sometimes they ask me, oh, should I talk in my first language or should I translate? And I'm like, no, talk in your first language. We want to hear those words in your first language. And then when we create a list of these formal and informal expressions in different languages, then we discuss the similarities and differences in terms of like linguistic similarities and differences. For example, we discussed that formally speaking, in many of the languages, sentences are longer, are expected to be grammatically correct, well punctuated, and this happens to all languages. And then we move on to English. So students start from old information and move on to new information, which cognitively can help them understand formal and informal English convention better. So this happens in English, like academic writing classes, but we can extend this to any class, really, subject areas. For example, in a math class or in a chemistry class, students can resolve the issue in their first language, or if they want to write a research paper, they can make an outline in their first language. They can take notes during the lectures in their first language. And then if they want to submit the final result to the instructor, of course, that should be done in the language of instruction. But the process could be definitely done in any language that works the best for the student, not necessarily the language of instruction.
Okay, well, I can see that there could be problems with this because what you're talking about is also an idealized multilingual classroom. And often what we have is a monolingual classroom and not the target language. So how would you address for this? Because it's really easy. I'll give you an example. In America, gosh, I think I took a year of French in high school and a semester of French at college. But when I completed those courses, I couldn't speak a word of French. And we spent the whole semester and the whole year on être and avoir. Because, the teacher would switch to English and all the students wanted this.
Okay, so that's in
a monolingual class, it's much more difficult to achieve where you're bringing all these different linguistic repertoires that everyone has to enable them to learn the language, because we're talking about a group of students that only speak one language. So they have nothing to bring in.
So thank you for that. And this is definitely, as I said, a valid concern. And I can understand why. I mean, I cannot comment on that context, but I can understand, the things that could have happened because I took Arabic courses in school back in Iran. And after a couple of years, when I traveled to Dubai for the first time, I thought that I could speak Arabic with, the shopkeepers. But then the moment I opened my mouth, they didn't understand whatever I was saying. So I had to switch to English. So I understand like spending time learning one language, but then we end up being in the context, in the, real world, and we find ourselves unable to use that language. So there are many reasons for that. And discussing this is beyond the scope of our talk today. But again, as I said, one thing that could happen is French in state doesn't have an official status. So maybe that context was the only context for students to be exposed to French, right? So in that context, of course, the more exposure to French, the better compared to learning French in France, for example, right? In a French, immersion or French rich context. But still in that class, in that French class, I mean, what could have happened was if you, for example, if a student wanted to write an essay in French, they could think about the elements of the story or the outline in English, right? And then they create an outline in English just to be on track and make sure what to write in introduction, what to write in the body, what to write in conclusion. So when they had that outline ready, then they would use English, French words and structure to compose the essay. So even I would argue, even in that context, it's not always impossible to follow the strategies that we've been talking about.
Okay, I think this is very true, and we should use all the linguistic repertoire that we have available. I'm just saying that some students don't have any other linguistic repertoire available besides one, right? And of course, we will use that one as we learn. We will use strategies such as translation, and as you've just mentioned, composing what we have to write in our head, in our language, and then, translating or adjusting until we achieve higher levels. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us today, Naghmeh. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you for having me, and have a great day.
Okay, and this has been Melanie Gobert, your host for today's episode of TTELT, Teaching Tips for English Language Teachers. We want you to know that there has been a change, and it is okay for students to use their other languages inside the English language classroom. Thank you, Naghmeh.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you for joining us today. Share with us how you are using these tips. Leave us a comment or voice message on social media or at ttelt.org. Thanks for joining this episode of TTELT, brought to you by educators worldwide. Follow, like, and subscribe to TTELT on your social media, and try a new teaching tip today.